So, Risk of Rain 3. What even is Risk of Rain 3? Well, it doesn't exist. But, nevertheless, we're going to talk about it. Nice. Nailed that intro. Okay, all jokes aside, I am going to be discussing Risk of Rain 3, if that's even what the name of the game will be. Yes, I know the game hasn't been teased or even mentioned to my knowledge, but of course, the potential to a sequel of the game is almost always on the table, and the same goes for Risk of Rain 2's future installment. However, I do predict that we are a pretty long way out from that at the time of this recording, as Hobo Games has slated content for Risk of Rain 2 out to Q4 of 2021, and the game will at least ride on that content for a while, so for all I know it may be years before it's even given a trailer, or the game just may not release at all. But it's definitely a possibility. Hobo Games has grown their team size and shows potential to keep growing, more powerful consoles and technology have been and are still being released after Risk of Rain 2, the fanbase for the game is ever growing, there's definitely some influence that may lead to a brand new installment of the Risk of Rain franchise. The big question I have, however, is not when it will release, rather what it will be. What would we want to see from this hypothetical Risk of Rain 3? Well, there are definitely a good number of things I think Risk of Rain 3 should have to make it the success that I and many others hope it will be. And here's a video on all that. Convenient. A really quick note, this is all purely my thoughts and speculation on a game that I don't even know is ever going to come out, so take them with a grain of salt. I'm going to assume that Risk of Rain 3 will probably stay within the same realm of gameplay that its two predecessors were in and be closest related to Risk of Rain 2, i.e. in 3D. But for all I know, the game could do a just complete 180 and be completely different from its predecessors, effectively negating all the points I'll be making in this video. Regardless, I'm going to assume that Risk of Rain 3 will share the same general aspects of its predecessors. So, with that little disclaimer out of the way, let's get into the video. The first thing I would want to see in Risk of Rain 3 is a change in the environments. Risk of Rain 2 has an amazing set of environments to explore. They're so varied and diverse and fun to navigate. However, I've had one nagging thought about them that I just can't make myself let go, and would be a great thing to address in Risk of Rain 3. The environments, at present, are a little small, and I think they could be made larger and denser in Risk of Rain 3. Now, this isn't a huge game-breaker deal want for Risk of Rain 3, but it's something that I would really appreciate be changed in Risk of Rain 3 for a couple of reasons. One being that larger and denser environments would better complement the emphasis of movement that Risk of Rain 3 will most likely have, assuming it follows the footsteps of Risk of Rain 2. Risk of Rain 2 has a ton of emphasis on movement. Practically every single survivor in the game has abilities that are centered around movement, and there are tons and tons of items that assist with making movement easier and faster. So with this in mind, I feel like the environments in Risk of Rain 2 are just too small. Like, later in the game, I can cross some of the environments in under a minute small. They have a good number of nooks and crannies to explore and are relatively dense, but overall I feel like they could just be larger. I want an environment that takes me a while to explore. I want an environment that I could get lost in, a place that is massive and dense and full of places to explore. We already have this huge emphasis on movement, and doubling down on it in the form of larger areas would make it so much better. In addition to making movement better, I think we need to see larger and denser environments because the environments are not procedurally generated. For those who don't know, Risk of Rain 2 is a roguelike, and most every roguelike has procedurally generated dungeons, or areas that are randomly changed every time you die and re-enter them, effectively making an almost infinite number of different dungeons. This is not the case in Risk of Rain 2, as there are a set number of environments that do not change. The only random variable to the environments is which of the two areas you will be greeted to on the next stage, one or the other, from the same two options every time. So after a while, you end up memorizing the environments unintentionally, and I think that takes away from the exploration aspect of procedurally generated dungeons. This could definitely be worked on in Risk of Rain 3 by making the environments larger and denser. It gives us more places to explore, more areas to see, more places to search. Sure, we may end up memorizing the environment layouts eventually, but if made complex enough, the environments may end up feeling randomly generated due to the sheer size and incomprehensibility of their space. You could also, in theory, solve this issue by making the environments be procedurally generated, but I don't know if this would work super well, as it may disrupt the general game flow that we are so used to in the Risk of Rain series. I mean, for one, searching for the randomly placed teleporter in a randomly generated area would be kind of hard and annoying. This would also probably be kind of hard to program, as Hobo Games can't just make different rooms appear in different orders like other roguelike game devs can. They have to physically change the landscape of the environments for each new run, and make sure the teleporter boss doesn't clip into a wall on spawn and other issues as such. Along with that, making the environments procedurally generated might take away from the lore and unique aspect of each area, so hopefully they stick to the non-procedurally generated dungeons. As another option, if they didn't want to make the areas bigger and can't make them randomly generated, they could potentially just opt to have more environments, which is a good idea, but I think I would still rather fewer environments that are larger and denser, because they both fill in the missing slot of procedurally generated dungeons and help double down on the emphasis of movement the game will most likely have, assuming it follows in the footsteps of Risk of Rain 2. More environments would just mean more of the same issue of 2 small environments, which doesn't really help much, so I think Hobo Games should make the environments in Risk of Rain 3 larger and denser. Next, a thing I think we all want to see in Risk of Rain 3 is more survivors. Now, don't get me wrong, Risk of Rain 2 has an amazing cast of survivors and they are all super fun and super unique, but if we're talking about making Risk of Rain 3, I think to live up to the expectation that the game will have, we should get even more exciting survivors added on. There are a couple ways to do this. Of course, an obvious one would be to take the survivors from the original Risk of Rain that didn't make the cut into the cast of Risk of Rain 2 and incorporate them into the cast of Risk of Rain 3 along with the already present characters in Risk of Rain 2. This is definitely a viable option as there are a good number of people who have played the original Risk of Rain and sorely miss some of the survivors' absence. I personally would love to see some of the OG characters get a transformation into 3D, as that was one of the most appalling things to me when playing Risk of Rain 2 survivors from the original Risk of Rain. I would love to see how Hopo Games manages to put in survivors like Chef and Sniper into the 3D world, and I'm sure many others would as well. As a side note, I know there have been plans to add survivors to Risk of Rain 2 from the original Risk of Rain, but I don't think they will get through every unused survivor in Risk of Rain 1 that quickly, so it's definitely something that Risk of Rain 3 could finish off from where Risk of Rain 2 started, unless they don't ever make Risk of Rain 3 and end up putting all the survivors in Risk of Rain 2. So if you're watching this in the future and they do that, then sorry for wasting a minute of your time. Another option is to make entirely new survivors. I don't think I really even need to explain why this is something most of us probably want in Risk of Rain 3, as it adds new dimension to the game, new ways to play, new things to try and have fun with, new lore, it's all positives. The only downside I could potentially see is that the newly made survivors start to feel similar to other pre-existing survivors. Hopo Games does have a smaller list of options of unique survivors to make since there are a good number of already existing survivors that the new survivors need to differentiate from. It is important that the survivors stay unique and interesting, or else they're not new survivors. However, I have no doubt that Hopo Games won't have a problem here, as the current cast of survivors from both the original Risk of Rain and Risk of Rain 2 are phenomenal and very unique and creative, and I'm sure they can pull off the same thing for new Risk of Rain 3 survivors. So, of those two options, returning old survivors or making new ones, which is best? Well, both. I mean, I don't see why not. I know, this would definitely be a very large challenge for Hopo Games to take on, as that is 15 unique survivors that they need to port over into Risk of Rain 3, 5 of which have no basis for 3D modeling, and all the while they would need to be making brand new survivors. But 1, they did that in Risk of Rain 2, and 2, I would honestly rather them at least try and the game take a while to release than them not try at all. Perhaps they could drip feed survivors and updates after they release the game like in Risk of Rain 2, but in all honesty, I would rather just wait a long time and have them all available at launch. But if they got a drip feed, then I would be fine with that too, and maybe they could already have all the survivors from the original Risk of Rain and Risk of Rain 2 in the game, and then drip feed new survivors as they are made. It will most likely take longer to make new survivors as they have no point of reference, so they can make all the survivors that they have a reference for initially and save the longer survivor projects for the drip feeding. That way we can play around with some fun and nostalgic survivors and also have expectations for who knows what survivors would be coming next. And lastly, a bit of a less significant want compared to the other two. Nevertheless, it's still a thing that I think we all want to see in Risk of Rain 3. A completely filled logbook. I think the logbook in Risk of Rain 2 is great. There's so much story to unpack, vague enough that theories and ideas can be made without solid confirmation, but specific enough that the lore is followable and able to be understood. I myself haven't even scraped the surface of all of it, due to the sheer time it takes, but just from what I've read from the logbook, there is a lot of well thought out content. However, it has to be noted that the logbook is incomplete, which, while understandable, is a bit of a disappointment. All of the items, enemies, environments, and survivors in the game have a lore section, but unfortunately, many of them are not yet filled. There are a lot of things in the logbook that I wish had some lore tied to them, and although I get that Hopo Games is rolling them out, I'm impatient. I want to sit and read the lore and make connections, as the lore often connects, and see what ideas I can make from them. Risk of Rain 2 has some amazing lore that I crave in specific survivors, items, enemies, and environments. However, I am unfortunately sometimes just met with an empty space. Every single thing in the game has a lore section, but some of them are just sitting there empty, and that makes me super curious about what kind of lore the empty space could have. And that's coming from me, someone who doesn't really spend that much time looking at the lore, so I'm sure many others who are more invested in the lore would also like to see the logbook completed, which could be done in Risk of Rain 3. However, if Hopo Games just can't fill in the lore for all the things in Risk of Rain 3, then I think they should at least make the missing lore consistent. Instead of having every single thing in the game have a lore section and not filling some of them in, perhaps they can only do lore on specific things, like only certain tier items or only on certain bosses or enemies and survivors or something. That way, we don't feel like we're missing out on any lore because there isn't any expectation of the lore to be filled, and that means that Hopo Games doesn't have to fill out that much lore if that's a time constraint. I'm kinda split on this, to be honest, as on one hand, I want to see everything in the game have lore just because the lore is often so fun to read, but on the other, I understand that not everything in the game needs lore tied to it, and having less consistent lore would save time for the developers when making the game. So either option would work for me, the key point being that we have a completely filled out book, whatever that looks like, on launch. I don't know in any certainty when Risk of Rain 3 will come out, or even if it will ever come out. I mean, Hopo Games is rolling pretty well on Risk of Rain 2 at the moment, and even if it came out, I have no idea if this hypothetical game will be in any way similar to the previous games in the Risk of Rain series at all. For all I know, it could be a life sim. So this whole video could end up having been a complete waste of time. However, I still think it's fun to speculate, and although I know a company like Hopo Games is most likely not going to listen to some random tiny YouTuber, I still think it's important that us fans make our ideas public, because company employees do in fact have ears and can hear what we're saying. And who knows, we might be able to make a positive impact on the potential Risk of Rain 3. But I want to know, what do you think about Risk of Rain 3? Do you think it will come out? Will it be similar to the previous Risk of Rains? What changes or additions would you want for the game? Be sure to comment down below, as I'm only one little man with one little brain, so I'd love to hear your perspectives on the matter. And who knows, maybe some crazy theories could turn out to be true. Risk of Rain 3 life sim?